Black students claimed the right to shape their education in a variety of ways. At Northwestern, they pressured the university to adopt African American studies, affirmative action, and other initiatives to promote greater inclusion and equality.
Hello, everyone. I'm Alice Kim, Director of the Public Square, which is a program of the Illinois Humanities Council. And I want to welcome all of you to this program this evening. The Public Square is about carving out spaces for public conversations like the one we're having tonight in all kinds of places and with all kinds of people. We're about presenting opportunities to bring people from all walks of life together in open, democratic forums, to dialogue and debate with one another, to collaborate together, and ultimately to conspire together to change the world and make a better future for all of us. That's why I am so thrilled about tonight's program. In the pages of the Black Revolution on campus, Martha Biondi vividly brings to life the extraordinary yet previously forgotten struggles of Black students in the 1960s and 70s who insisted that their lives and their education mattered and dared to reimagine higher education as a multiracial learning environment that served their communities. With honesty and flair, Martha gives voice to the courage, creativity, and sacrifice of Black students and other students of color who organized hundreds of protests in the late 1960s and 70s and who shaped and made history. At a time when the future of public education is in question, her book is an invaluable contribution to our understanding of social movements and, in particular, the role of student protest in shaping and transforming education as we know it. And also, tonight, following Martha's talk, we'll bring up the brilliant Barbara Ransby to the stage, who always helps us to think hard about the issues at hand without shying away from what's tough or controversial. She'll be in conversation with Martha about her book. Then we'll have plenty of time for questions and comments from all of you. Before I hand things over to Martha, I want to thank the Carlos Tortolera and the Chicago Cultural Center for hosting us here, and all of our co-sponsors, Northwestern Department of African American Studies, where Martha teaches, the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, and the Social Justice Initiative at UIC. I also want to thank CAN TV and Chicago Amplified for recording this program. And last but not least, I want to thank my colleagues, Paula Bowie, Mallory Laurel, Jeff Banks, and Monica Collins for their help in making this program happen. And so now, without any further ado, please welcome Martha Biondi, a people's historian in the real sense of what that means.
Good evening. I'm thrilled to be here this evening to talk to you about the Black Revolution on campus. I want to begin by thanking everyone who made this evening possible. Everyone at the Chicago Cultural Center, at the Illinois Humanities Council, and at the Public Square, especially Alice Kim, Carlos Velasquez, and Paula Bowie. Alice Kim's commitment to community building and her vision for a democratic public square are deeply inspiring. In addition, I'm honored to share the stage with historian Barbara Ransby, who will join the conversation later this evening. I want to begin my remarks with a reminder of the power of protest in our own time. As we know, we're in a period of uprising and protest around the world, from Tunisia and Egypt to Chile, Nigeria, Spain, Greece, China, and the United States. In the most basic sense, the protests against austerity in Europe, the Arab Spring, and the Occupy Wall Street movement, among others, demonstrate people's desire to improve their own lives and affect the course of history. These protests have attracted sustained media attention, changed the political conversation, and even the policy agenda. Moreover, these global activists have been influential even as they've faced police crackdowns, killings, and mass arrests. People have become aware of their own power to effect dramatic and far-reaching change, even as the outcomes of so many of these struggles remain precarious and uncertain. Black college students in the late 1960s and early 1970s played a similar role as this global upsurge has today. At the Black student movement's peak, from 1968 to 1970, tens of thousands of African American students staged their own Occupy movements at colleges around the country. They went on strike, occupied buildings, and conducted sit-ins. This happened at literally hundreds of campuses nationwide, from San Diego to Washington, Madison to Durham, Los Angeles, Detroit, and Boston, and all points in between. The student activists dominated headlines, changed the political conversation, and affected the policy agenda. All of a sudden, terms like Black studies and open admissions and non-negotiable demands were in the national vocabulary. No one had ever heard these words before. The students made themselves into historically significant agents of change. They had a profound impact on the character of higher education in the United States and the dynamics of the Black freedom struggle. Unfortunately, like contemporary global activism, Black student protests drew an intense police response. Police occupied the campus of San Francisco State University for months, engaging in violent skirmishes with students. This slide shows the tactical squad arresting an injured student at San Francisco State. California Governor Ronald Reagan took a hard line. There were over 1,000 arrests at colleges in California, and many students served serious time in prison. Some were even deported. Police infiltrated Black student unions and sometimes arrested students on false charges. But tragically, repression went beyond unjust arrest and beyond unjust incarceration. Police, together with the National Guard and state police officers, invaded many campuses, even shooting and killing several Black students. This happened at South Carolina State University in Orangeburg, at North Carolina A&T, at Jackson State University, and Southern University in Louisiana. This photo illustrates the holes left by police bullets fired into a dormitory in 1970 at Jackson State, an historically Black college in Mississippi. Today I want to talk about two local examples of protests from this era. One at Northwestern, an elite private research university in Evanston, and one at Crane College, a public two-year junior college in Chicago. These colleges illustrate the diversity of the Black student movement. The movement affected both elite universities and community colleges. In fact, urban public institutions were really at the center of Black student organizing and activism. In later years, African American studies would become associated with elite scholars and Ivy League universities. We all know who I'm talking about. But the movement began close to urban Black communities and was inspired, shaped, and galvanized by the broader Black power upsurge. Both campuses, Northwestern and Crane, produced disciplined and savvy organizers who championed campus improvement and greater African American access to higher education. And some of them are even sitting here in the audience. Black students claimed the right to shape their education in a variety of ways. At Northwestern, they pressured the university to adopt African American studies, affirmative action, and other initiatives to promote greater inclusion and equality. In contrast, the students at Crane aimed for the infusion of Black content across the curriculum. Crane came to symbolize the quest for Black control of an institution in a Black community, as it was renamed Malcolm X College and gained an African American president. Well before victories in City Hall, public two-year colleges in cities such as Chicago, Oakland, Detroit, and New York became early sites of Black administrative management in a context of urban so-called white flight. Northwestern and Malcolm X both produced a generation of student leaders who went on to play important roles in academia, law, and politics for decades in Chicago and across the country. I'll begin with Northwestern. In the early morning hours of May 4th, 1968, exactly a month after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., 100 black students occupy the university's bursar office. With a well-organized supply and communications network, and eventually a large group of white student sympathizers surrounding the building, they vowed to stay until the administration met their demands. A few days earlier, the New York City Police Department had forcibly ejected Columbia University students from campus buildings, arresting 700 and injuring 150. Northwestern students feared a similar police raid, and the Evanston police were reportedly eager to move in. What provoked virtually every black student to join a protest that might lead to arrest, expulsion, or loss of financial aid? In short, integration. Integration, the students felt, was a white-defined project that had failed to meet their needs. In contrast, they offered an alternative conception of campus inclusion and racial reform. In 1965, there were 26 black students at Northwestern, 20 of whom were athletes. The athletes' experience of integration was telling. One day, Don Jackson, who played on the basketball team, was walking down Sheridan Road with his white male and female classmates. A member of the university's board of trustees happened to drive by and saw Jackson, who was later instructed to avoid being seen in public with white females. Such alarm over black male, white female intimacy is perhaps more associated with the Jim Crow South. But black student athletes across the country reported strong pressure from athletic departments not to date white females. The Higher Education Act of 1965 increased federal aid to universities, spurring colleges to increase the admission of African American and other underrepresented students. This marked the beginning of a more significant black student presence on many white campuses. Northwestern admitted 54 African American freshmen in 1966, up from just 5 the year before. And during that summer, the university established the Chicago Action Project to acclimate incoming freshmen recruited from Chicago. In a classic articulation of post-war liberalism, Northwestern labeled these students culturally deprived and required their participation in weekly cultural outings. It was so shocking to me. Participant Sandra Hill said, that they would tell me with a straight face that I was culturally deprived. More black female students came that fall than ever before, and a few faced rejection from their white roommates, who had the option of choosing a same-race roommate, a right that black students were denied. Sandra Malone said she came, quote, not expecting racism, but within minutes of her arrival, her white roommate requested a transfer. When it was discovered that Sandra Hill had been assigned a black roommate, evidently by mistake, Northwestern offered the students single rooms. Quote, they did not want 2 African Americans rooming together, Hill said. Students who took over the bursar's office demanded all black living units in order to give African Americans the same option that whites had enjoyed. They treated us like objects, Catherine Ogletree recalled, and wanted to maximize our exposure. In addition to housing, the other major source of racial animus on campus was the all-white Greek organizations, which were recurring sites of physical clashes and racial insult during this entire period. Events in 1967 spurred a new militancy on campus. The riots of the late 1960s are often recognized for their effects on national politics or housing policy or law enforcement practice. But they had a significant effect on black students and university administrators, heightening the mobilization for reform. That summer, Detroit and Newark exploded in the most serious domestic unrest since World War I. 50 black people were killed, over 1,000 people were injured, and thousands more were arrested. Black students organized a new student organization called For Members Only, or FMO, in order to nurture and unite the community. The president of FMO was a young woman, Catherine Ogletree, a freshman from Chicago's West Side. Her leadership was a rare example of female leadership in a black student union on campus in this black nationalist era. James Turner, a charismatic graduate student in sociology, headed the smaller Afro-American Student Union. The students studied and debated theories of social change, engaging in regular rap sessions on the works of revolutionary theorists like Frantz Fanon, Amilcar Cabral, and Karl Marx. Quote, "The level of consciousness raising was extreme," remembers one student. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. sparked an escalation of black student protest all over the country. But at Northwestern, Dr. King's murder actually shifted attention off campus. Many black students were from West Side neighborhoods that were under police lockdown after King's murder, and they focused their immediate energies on their families and communities in Chicago. But they returned to campus feeling additional responsibility to make inroads on the North Shore that would benefit a greater number of black Chicagoans. Ultimately, they presented the administration with a list of demands. They asked for many things, including that Northwestern acknowledge that it has been a racist institution and declare its opposition to racism on campus and in Evanston. They asked for the admission of more black students toward a goal of a 10 to 12% black student body, with half coming from the inner city. A shift in financial aid away from work requirements to grants. A change in housing policy so that black students who had previously been required to live apart could choose to live together. They asked for black studies courses with black professors chosen by the students, since, quote, "no one in the administration is capable of adequately judging their qualifications." They asked for a facility to house black student organizations and activities, since black students have nothing at Northwestern to call our own. And finally, they asked that Northwestern fully desegregate its real estate holdings in Evanston. Their tone was insistent. "We have been to the administration before, but with very little consequence. We want tangible results, not excuses or even promises." One could say a great deal about these demands, but I'll just underscore their breadth, their attention to class and finance, to curricular and extracurricular activities, and their attention to space, to carving out space and claiming space. After the administration rejected most of their demands, a small group of student activists began to plan for a major action. During this process, the students wanted to protect each other and guard against an informant. So, borrowing from the film, The Battle of Algiers, they used a system of secret cells. The Battle of Algiers was a cinematic treatment of the Algerian struggle against French colonialism. It became a sacred text to young revolutionaries worldwide, including African American college students. Students worked in groups or cells of 3. This way, nobody knew more than 2 other people involved. Their caution turned out to be justified. At a mass meeting the night before the sit-in, student leaders announced plans to occupy the administration building. They intentionally gave false information. And sure enough, the next morning, the administration building was filled with Northwestern police. The choice of the building to occupy reflected the careful planning that went into every facet of the protest. The Bursar building was manageable in size and was critical to university functions, as it housed the central computer system. Indeed, the fact that one of the student leaders was a computer whiz was made known to the administration at a critical juncture in the negotiations. In order to cultivate wide support and participation in the protest, every student was assigned a task. 2 had to procure chains and locks. Victor Good, a future director of the National Conference of Black Lawyers, was part of the diversion team to lure the police away. Wayne Watson, currently president of Chicago State, coordinated the acquisition of a large supply of food with the assistance of Evanston teenagers. They were preparing for a very long sit-in. 100 of the total black student population of 115 took part in the protest. So the overwhelming majority of black students on campus participated. Student leaders were remarkably successful in building trust. Early on the morning of May 3rd, students gathered in an alley near the Bursar building, and when the diversion team raced off toward the administration building to distract the security guard, they rushed inside. The students used a sophisticated media strategy that illustrated their commitment to the idea of self-determination. Fearing that the media would misinterpret their actions, they wanted to personally control the framing of their story. They had cultivated ties with Jeff Kamen, the host of a popular talk radio show in Chicago, who had previously covered the Southern Civil Rights Movement. Kamen was told to be on a particular street corner at a specified time on May 3rd. When the students had taken over the building and decided the time was ripe to announce their demands, they used his microphone to directly state their demands to the thousands of listeners in Chicago. Northwestern President J. Roscoe Miller was at a meeting of the board of directors of the Sears Company when he learned about the takeover. He directed his subordinates to, quote, call the cops and throw the students in jail. But a vice president persuaded Miller to agree to negotiations. He feared that there would be disastrous results if the police were summoned. The fact that Dr. King had been murdered only a month before likely helped discourage administrators from calling the police. Lucius Gregg, the only black administrator at Northwestern, was on the negotiating team. Concerned parents of students inside the Bursar office had been telephoning Gregg and were relieved to hear that the protests would be resolved without the police. The negotiating team also credited this same vice president's constructive role in reaching a settlement. He thought the demands were quite reasonable and wanted to accede to all of them, but felt the university needed to save face. So they crafted a statement in which the settlement appeared more balanced. But the students understood. It was a big victory. It was difficult for Northwestern to acknowledge that it shared in the racism of the broader society. The students felt that genuine change would only begin after such an admission. The first paragraph of the agreement that they ultimately reached began, quote, Northwestern recognizes that throughout its history, it has been a university of the white establishment. Lucius Gregg said that they debated this plank for hours, spending more time on it than anything else. The agreement marked a turning point at Northwestern. In essence, it projected a new paradigm for racial reform, rejecting an ostensibly colorblind approach which had left white status unchallenged and not made meaningful space for black participation, in favor of a more race-conscious efforts toward inclusion. The university's statement narrated this shift. Quote, for many of us, the solution has always seemed to be one of simply obliterating in our laws and in our personal relations the distinction between the races. We are now learning that this does not come to grips with the problems of the present turbulent era of transition. In short, this means that special recognition and special concern must be given for some unspecified time to the black community that is emerging within our institution. Northwestern would not commit to admit a set percentage of black students, but they did agree to seek 50% of black students from inner city schools. That was never achieved, which is another story, right? How these agreements and concessions get enforced, but we can talk about that later. The students felt a strong sense of responsibility to young people from poor urban communities. Their sensitivity to class was not an anomaly in the Black Power era. The riots forced attention to socioeconomic conditions, and young people from these neighborhoods became politically active and carried this awareness with them to college campuses. Northwestern agreed to increase financial aid, create space for black student activities, and expand studies of black history and black culture in the university. Lerone Bennett, a leading historian and executive editor of Ebony magazine, was later hired as the first chair of the Department of African American Studies at Northwestern. Even though there was elation and relief on campus, media reaction to the settlement was mixed. Many news outlets assailed the decision not to call the police. The media was often thirsting for police action in these years, all over the country. The Chicago Tribune denounced the university and portrayed the students as ungrateful and criminal. Northwestern, quote, had condoned lawlessness and agreed to a humiliating and complete capitulation, it wrote. The Tribune ridiculed the deans for having negotiated and called the sit-in, quote, more like that of an outbreak in a penitentiary than of a university dedicated to intellectual freedom. The Tribune was especially incensed at the university's acknowledgement of white racism, quote, that invidious term coined gratuitously by the Kerner Commission and eagerly accepted by every masochistic breastfeeder in the white liberal community. Finally, the paper accused the students of seeking, quote, apartheid on campus and of harboring hatred toward whites. The significantly different response by the Chicago Daily News began, quote, Northwestern has never been regarded as a pace-setter of liberalism. And one of the surprises to come out of its showdown with black students was the university's ability to cope with radical change. The paper condemned the students' tactics, but noted with approval that violence had been avoided. The May 4th agreement, as it was termed, exposed Northwestern to a period of intense scrutiny, but backing from the Board of Trustees and timely donations from local corporate and financial titans shored up their position. At a critical moment, the director of Chicago-based Harris Bank walked into the president's office and wrote a check for a very large sum. Jewel Food Stores and the Esso Corporation and others soon made large contributions. Fearing the spread of urban unrest, corporate America was making peace with campus reform. The May 4th agreement helped catapult Northwestern onto the national stage and increase its competitiveness. Both the development and admissions offices closely monitored the aftermath of the protests for effects on giving and applications, and both went up. Another point I'd like to make, and this was true at many other schools as well, is that activism can change people as much as institutions. A social movement can redirect career paths and create an influential cohort in the broader public sphere. The leaders that emerged from the struggles of the late 1960s at both Northwestern and Malcolm X went on to play leading roles in social justice movements nationally. I'll give one illustration now. Naturally, parents were concerned about their children's participation in a building takeover. And in one instance, a father commanded his daughter to leave the bursar office. Eva Jefferson Patterson, in this picture, called her parents after they had taken over the bursar office. They told me to leave or they would cut off my money for school, she said. All our parents were afraid for us. Patterson left through a window and began collecting supplies for the students. But the experience had already changed her, and she decided to go back in. The next day, I decided I would support myself at Northwestern, and she went back inside. She stayed in Evanston over that tumultuous summer and ended up getting tear-gassed at the demonstrations around the Democratic Convention. In many respects, her life revealed in microcosm a process that many others in her generation were undergoing. They were going through formative activist experiences, not in any year, but in 1968, a year of intense political upheaval and mobilization in the United States and around the world. Patterson went on to become a leader in the anti-war movement and was elected the first African-American president of Associated Student Government at Northwestern. Here, she is debating Vice President Spiro Agnew as a 20-year-old live on television. She has spent her professional life as a civil rights lawyer in California. In many cities, the Black student movement was based at community colleges. I've mentioned this already in Oakland, Detroit, New York, and other cities. Two-year Crane College, one of the Chicago city colleges, became a center of the Black liberation movement in Chicago. Black students virtually took over the school, won a Black president, redefined its mission, and rechristened it Malcolm X College. By the late 1960s, this public institution, located on the predominantly black West Side, had a majority black student body, but a largely white faculty, curriculum, and administration. The student leaders who emerged at Crane were slightly older. In their mid-20s, many were raising families, and many had served in the military. Standish Willis was a leading activist at Crane. Born on the West Side to Southern parents, he graduated from Crane High School, became a father at age 17, flunked out of Crane College in his first semester, and then joined the Air Force for 4 years. He re-enrolled at Crane College in 1966 while also working as a city bus driver. After hearing a lecture on black history, Willis started the Negro History Club, and students began reading and discussing history. Not long after, the popular club changed its name to the Afro-American History Club and linked up with students doing black history-related initiatives on other campuses. Henry English also became active on campus. His family moved to Chicago from Mississippi when English was 6. He served in the Marine Corps for 5 years and entered Crane in the fall of 1966. We wanted to change the mission and character of the whole campus, he recalled. As on other campuses, the students revered Malcolm X and admired SNCC leader Stokely Carmichael, SNCC referring to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. According to Willis, the students' black nationalism was new and controversial, even in black communities. I remember in my household people saying, "Why are you growing your hair like that?" But after a while, the whole community was kind of feeling it. After complaining that the student newspaper prints no news that is controversial or thought-provoking, black student activists created the Phoenix, which became a fount of creativity and gave students space to explore and debate new cultural and political ideas. Again, reflecting the idea of self-determination, which took root in this era, and the notion of building your own institutions. One student wrote in the Phoenix, quote, "The critical mental shift that they faced entailed not seeing the U.S. as the land of the free and home of the brave, but as a racist, sickening society. This more critical posture toward the nation as a whole, not just the South, set many black power advocates apart from integrationists. The students set out to build a movement to reshape the college. We were energetic and idealistic," Henry English recalls, "and in some ways out of touch with reality. Because of that, we didn't see any restrictions, and because of that, we were able to bring about a lot of change." The students built power through many channels. Their first strategy was to take over student government. Stan Willis was elected president of the Student Senate in 1967. Robert Clay, also a leader in the Afro-American History Club, succeeded Willis, and Henry English succeeded Clay. Additionally, English was a founder and first president of the Chicago City College student government. At the same time, he became a leader in the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party. "We became a formidable group," Henry English recalled. As Stan Willis put it, "We were all working-class kids who, for the most part, lived on the west side of Chicago." The police killings of 3 black students on the campus of South Carolina State in Orangeburg in February 1968 had a galvanizing effect on black students nationwide, including students at Crane. Now, typically, the murder of Martin Luther King in April 1968 is often recognized by many scholars of student activism as the catalyst that sparked an escalation of student tactics across the nation. But I think it's critically important to put the murders at Orangeburg in this story of causation. The murders at Orangeburg were whitewashed by South Carolina officialdom. None of the law enforcement officials were ever convicted of murder. There's a movie about it called Orangeburg, The Forgotten Massacre, but the point I want to make is that black students didn't forget it, and their outrage over these murders was felt nationally and inspired action. So at Crane, the Orangeburg Massacre inspired a new militancy among the students. Stan Willis organized a march through the neighborhood in the guise of a funeral procession, complete with a casket. This march will also give notice, Willis wrote in the Phoenix, to the city, the nation, and the world that the members of Crane College have thrust themselves into an all-out fight against human injustice and human misery. While Crane was a small school, relatively speaking, it became a focal point for black activism in the city. Students from Malcolm X, Northwestern, and other colleges connected with each other via a lively and vibrant black arts movement in the city. A focal point was the Afro Arts Theater, which was owned by legendary Chicago musician Phil Coran, a founder of the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians. Steve Colson, a Northwestern student who took part in the Bursar sit-in, was a member of the AACM. Poets Hakeem Madhubuti, Gwendolyn Brooks, and Amiri Baraka performed at the Afro Arts Theater, and activists such as Stokely Carmichael attracted large crowds. Carmichael was at the height of his influence among black college students. Wherever he was, Stan Willis said, we went. Unfortunately, the theater's connections, the Afro Arts Theater's connections to radical activists and artists brought police raids and other harassment, leading Phil Coran to close it in 1971. Crane's neighborhood was home to a chapter of the Black Panther Party under the leadership of Fred Hampton. The Black Panther Party in Chicago attracted students from Roosevelt, University of Illinois, and many city college campuses. And as a result, students played an important role in the local leadership of the party. Moreover, the Panthers targeted community colleges as profitable places to organize. Hampton, as well as future Congressman Bobby Rush, came to Crane to organize students, and Fred Hampton even enrolled there in the fall of 1967. Henry English was in the Panthers' Central Committee, and one of his party assignments was organizing students. In a Phoenix article called What Black Students Want, student Willie Calvin echoed the Panthers' 10-point platform in his framing of education as a right of citizenship. Quote, we believe that the city and federal government is responsible and obligated to give every man a decent education as so defined by their Jive Constitution. I think it's important to underscore that the students saw access to higher education as a right, not as a privilege, and one that should be available to all who sought it. In this context of turmoil, high expectation, and solidarity, student leaders submitted a list of demands to the administration. In May 1968, the students issued 10 demands designed to make Crane, quote, intellectually and socially relevant to the community as a whole. Since the student body at Crane is predominantly black, and the community is predominantly black, they wrote, the curriculum and academic policies should cater to the needs of the black students in this institution and to the black people in this community. The students wanted, quote, the integration of the history of African Americans into the existing curriculum of the entire college. And they boycotted professors who did not support their vision. If you could not integrate African Americans into the curriculum, they said, then you should find somewhere else to go. There were only a handful of African American professors or instructors at Crane. One was Carol Adams, who would become a prominent cultural and education leader in Chicago for decades and is currently the CEO of the DuSable Museum of African American History. The students' goal was to bring in more black professors. Many of the white teachers could not relate to the surge of black nationalist feeling among the students, and many would leave after Crane became Malcolm X. Student rights were also central to their vision and movement. The first demand was actually for a formal policy enshrining student rights, and the second asked for the right of students to name the college's new campus. They demanded a black president, more black instructors, more black clerical personnel, and the upgrading of existing black workers, new American history texts which covered the African American experience without distortions, as well as more advanced courses in the curriculum to promote greater readiness for transfer to four-year institutions. In a sign of the students' extraordinary political skills, and certainly the activism and ferment on the West Side more generally, they won virtually every demand. In May 1969, Malcolm X College got a black president, the first in the city college system. Interestingly, in light of the largely male leadership at the college and the general male thrust of black power politics, Several students pushed for a woman, Barbara Lewis King, at that time an assistant dean on campus, for college president. Henry English described her as an imposing woman who cared about the students. "We didn't understand that this was way ahead of the time," he said, "and they hired a man instead." Henry English was in jail when Charles Hurst, a 41-year-old audiologist at Howard, visited campus, so he missed the interview. But other students were impressed, and Hurst got the job and arrived with a lot of fanfare. The students had begun calling Crane Malcolm X before the name was officially adopted. "We were following international events," Stan Willis remembered. "We knew about Lumumba and Nkrumah, referring to the first post-colonial presidents of the Congo and Ghana. And this made us feel like black people should be running this college and it should be named after a black person." The city colleges balked and then promoted Booker T. Washington as the new name. But the students stood their ground, and in September 1969, Crane was renamed Malcolm X College. Malcolm X was born with high ideals and a dynamic, community-oriented vision. Its stated goals were, quote, self-actualization and a new social order through the educational process. There was an open admissions policy. This was a new innovation of the era that other cities also adopted, and in some places it generated great controversy. Open admissions was fundamentally a critique of admission standards at public colleges, and it was premised on the view that tax-supported institutions existed to serve all of the people. Malcolm X also embodied many of the ideals of black nationalism and self-determination. The student handbook for the 1970-71 academic year featured a bold red, black, and green cover emblazoned with Malcolm X College and the words education, liberation, and unity around a clenched fist. It included a comprehensive, detailed section on student rights and responsibilities. Martin Luther King's and Malcolm X birthdays were both included among school holidays. And Phil Coran of the AACM and African Heritage Ensemble composed the school song. African rhythms, courtesy of Phil Coran's band, infused the first Malcolm X commencement ceremonies in 1970. Dick Gregory was awarded an honorary doctorate, and awards were given to Illinois Panther Chairman Bobby Rush and Mrs. Frances Hampton, the mother of recently slain Panther leader Fred Hampton. And a sign of how interconnected student activism in the area had become, James Turner, a student leader at Northwestern and the newly appointed director of the Center for Africana Studies at Cornell University, gave the graduation address at Malcolm X, at the first graduation address. "Your people need you," he declared. "They need doctors, lawyers, architects." 2 years later, an accrediting team praised Malcolm X College for its utilization of indigenous leadership at all program levels. I want to close with a point about the significance of the black student movement at Malcolm X. Like Northwestern, it produced an influential generation of leaders in law, politics, and education. I have hinted at that throughout. Malcolm X also came to exemplify the quest for black control of a public institution. In Chicago, this proved to be an important pathway to black political power. In a city with a black political class closely tethered to the machinations of Mayor Richard Daley, student protests helped usher in changes that reverberated more broadly in the city's political, cultural, and institutional life, laying the groundwork for a wider upsurge of independent black organizing and assertion. Well before victories in City Hall, public two-year colleges in cities such as Chicago, Oakland, Detroit, and New York became early sites of black management. Finally, to underscore a key point from both struggles that remain relevant today, black student activists insisted that higher education was a right, not a privilege. They rejected the market-driven approach that dominates the contemporary landscape and viewed the discourse of merit as laden with disguised class and race privilege. In this sense, the students pushed the civil rights movement beyond a quest for equal opportunity into the current system, into a quest for much wider opportunity in a transformed system. Finally, students often ask me about additional lessons we can learn from the 1960s era of protest. One is to strive to be attentive to both local and global conditions. Pay close attention to your local context and environment, but stay deeply conversant with national and international events. And I think that's a particular legacy from the 1960s. A second legacy from both of these campus struggles in the Chicago area is to seek to fuse thought and action. The students in this story engage the world both intellectually and practically. Social change does not come from either or, but from both. They joined study books, read and debated books, but also went to demonstrations, community forums, and town hall meetings. We'll organize them. Organizing requires building relationships. Movement building is a process. It doesn't happen overnight. But as these stories illustrate, its gifts and benefits are deeply enriching and hold out the hope of making a better world. Thank you.
All right, I want to thank Martha again for so eloquently reminding us of the power of protest, that what we do can and does make a difference, and for telling the stories of movement heroes who not only knew a better world was possible, but demanded it. So Barbara Ransby has come to the stage. She's going to be in conversation with Martha to explore some of the issues that her book raises.
Well, first of all, thank you for the talk, and more importantly, thank you for the book. And I just want to sort of augment Alice Kim's introduction of Martha. Martha is a colleague and a friend, and I know that she has worked tirelessly on this project, and indeed it was a labor of love and comes out of her own spirit of activism. And so I want to thank you for the book, because I think it really gives us another chapter in understanding the Black freedom struggle, and a hopeful chapter in looking back. How do you see the book contributing to and changing the narrative about the Black freedom movement?
Okay, great. Well, I think it does in several respects, but I think a primary one is that still in many textbooks and general treatments of the civil rights and Black freedom struggle, 1968 is often identified as the year that the movement ends or unravels. The assassination of Dr. King, urban rebellions, these are often cited as the kind of moment of unraveling. And what my research revealed was, actually in contrast, the period from 1968 to 1972 was really the high watermark of the Black liberation movement. And there were tremendous gains of these years. Another way in which I think this book will help change the narrative is that it will demonstrate some great achievements and accomplishments of this phase of the movement. The Black Power era is sometimes criticized by civil rights scholars as, not leading to congressional laws like this 1964 Civil Rights Act or the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But I think what I try and identify in the book is that this wave of Black student activism, and it was nationwide, really transformed higher education, and that was an extraordinary contribution leading to open admissions, and this took many forms. Open admissions, affirmative action, Black cultural centers, more Black faculty, and very importantly, the creation of Black studies programs and departments. So it's a real achievement of the Black Power era or of the Black liberation movement after 1968.
And gives a real sense of those struggles as helping to democratize campuses. Campuses have a long way to go, but it was about race and racism. It was about Black liberation, but it was also about working class students demanding a say in their own education and demanding that universities be accountable, a struggle which is long from won, but that made some strides. You talked about the Chicago struggle, about Crane and about Northwestern, but you have some other great case studies in the book. You talk about Brooklyn College, you talk about San Francisco State. Can you put it in a larger, can you put the two snapshots you gave us today in the larger context? How did Chicago struggles compare to what was happening nationally?
Well, in some ways we were fortunate here in that there wasn't the kind of police violence that happened in other cities and in other states. The origin of this story is really in the South, in HBCUs at Howard, and in California. The Black student movement in California was very much on the vanguard of this struggle. But as I mentioned in my remarks, Governor Reagan was governor. He really relished a kind of confrontation with students. And police occupied the campus of San Francisco State for months. They beat up students. There were many injuries. Students were incarcerated. Some did up to a year in prison. Several did long sentences. And students on the campuses of historically black colleges suffered a much higher degree of police invasion, and as I mentioned, even murder. So students on HBCUs were much more likely to suffer police invasion and murder. So in Chicago, there was, I think that's one way in which it stood out certainly from the South and from California. But this was a nationwide struggle. It was happening at all kinds of colleges. Public, private, 2-year, 4-year, black colleges, predominantly white colleges.
And nationally is one bigger frame, but internationally was a part of the frame too. I mean, I was struck by the people you interviewed talking about Fanon and Cabral and the people that they were reading. How did that influence what they saw as possible, or the set of ideas that people were wrestling with as they made these demands?
Well, it did in a couple of ways. I mean, in one primary way is that it influenced a kind of shift in identity, away from seeing African Americans as a national minority, to part of a global majority. And I think, Malcolm X was a real icon, and I think he, often articulated this project. And so students read widely by international writers. And when they demanded black studies, they did not want a U.S.-centered conception of African American studies. They really, their fight was infused with the notion of Pan-Africanism, or in some places what was termed Third Worldism, right? They were very influenced by this idea of the Third World Project and of aligning with Latino students and Asian American students to create radical anti-colonial intellectual projects on many campuses. So that was one way in which the international context and thinking more broadly and globally influenced their struggle. It also influenced their struggle in practical ways. Many students, when they graduated, of course, for most of the key leaders, this was the beginning of a lifetime of activism. And they went in many directions. Some went to law school and became attorneys. Some became educators, became founders of the field of African American studies. Some went into the factories and said, well, it's great to organize students, but we really have to organize workers and unions in the working class. Some said, our role as African American radicals is to help build strong post-colonial African nations, and we need to relocate to the continent. And several student campus leaders ended up joining these very concrete African solidarity movements. Prexy Nesbitt here in the audience was very involved in the struggle to end Portuguese colonialism in Southern Africa, and then in the anti-apartheid movement. There's really a straight through line of student activists in 68, 69 on campuses to then the anti-apartheid struggle later on in the 1970s and 1980s.
So when we think, I think a lot of times our students think back on the 60s and 70s, and they think, everybody was on the same page. It was all about unity. Everybody got together and, to fight the good fight. But there was opposition to this. There was opposition even among black intellectuals to this project. And there were differences, ideological differences between folks who were fighting for black studies. So can you speak to some of the opposition and some of the intellectual debates and political debates within the fight for black studies?
Okay, it's a great question. There are probably 3 ways to answer it, right? So there's a lot of opposition that sometimes took a violent form by white students who opposed this movement. One of the early images I showed, and I apologize because I didn't really explain it, it was an image of armed students with bullets around their neck leaving the Willard Straight Hall in Cornell in 1969. And the students had taken over a building at Cornell in protest over a cross burning in front of a student residence that had many black women living there. And so They were facing racist harassment and threats, and they were protesting this cross-burning. And when they had taken over a building, rumors reached them that a band of white students was going to forcibly evict them, and they were armed, and they were going to seize the building. So arms were brought into that building so the students could have some measure of protection. So that's one example. The most famous, probably, example of white student opposition was at Cornell, and even induced the students to arm themselves during their takeover. They didn't enter with arms. That wasn't their plan. That was a peaceful protest. But they were following, of course, Malcolm X's call to defend themselves and the call of the Black Panther Party to engage in armed self-defense. So that's one example of kind of opposition.
That's external, the
that's
racist
external,
opposition,
the racist opposition. And then there were internal differences. You asked about this question of unity. Unity was certainly the aspiration, but there were, intense ideological debates. And students, I think one of the source of vitality and richness of this period was the range of opinion and the range of political positions. And students were questioning and reading. And as I mentioned, some went in a Pan-Africanist direction. Others went in a labor direction. Probably the two most famous kind of ideological polls in 1968, 1969 on college campuses were the revolutionary nationalists or the cultural nationalists. And probably the most famous example of that, where it really became a very tragic conflict, was on the campus of UCLA in January 1969. And there was a dispute over who was going to control a new Black Studies program on campus. There were community members involved, students involved. The Black Panther Party was involved. Some of the students were members of the party. Some students were members of the US organization, a cultural nationalist organization led by Ron Karenga. And that with evidently with FBI stoking and involvement, it culminated in a shootout on campus that left 2 young men killed. So that was unfortunately a bloody example of a rivalry between cultural nationalists and revolutionary nationalists. In some way, that paints a false portrait of that rivalry, because it usually just ended in maybe creating different organizations or rich and interesting debates on campus. But they often, I think more often than not, would join together when there was a building takeover or there was a student strike. I mean, there was a student strike for 5 months on the campus of San Francisco State that was extraordinarily effective. And those students included, the Bay Area, they included a range of ideological positions, but they held strong for that strike. So there was ideological difference and debate, and it was robust and it was interesting. But in many cases, they did achieve unity, at least in those moments, to pull off those direct action protests. Another form of difference was then in the intellectual part of this movement. And I should note that my book is probably 3/4 student activism and 1/4 intellectual history. And it looks at the early Black Studies movement, which was one outgrowth, one outcome of these struggles. It was a key demand that the students asked for. They asked for a transformation of the curriculum. And so many universities, that was one concession they were willing to make. And then what emerged in the aftermath of that, when these programs were developed, is that a lot of students envisioned that African American scholars would staff these new units. And what began to emerge was that many African American PhDs at this time had been trained, like all scholars in the United States, in traditional disciplines. Black studies didn't exist when they were in graduate school, and they got their PhDs in anthropology, history, English, political science. And a lot of these disciplines saw Black studies as politicized, as perhaps not academically legitimate, or as something that shouldn't stand alone as a separate department, maybe should be integrated into the English department, integrated into the political science department. So they were not often very receptive or interested in this call to join Black Studies department.
You teach in an African American Studies department now, and there's been lots of debates, and I think I'm thinking back to the Manning Marable, Skip Gates debate about the role of African American Studies programs connected to communities, and many today are pretty disconnected from communities, and I think your book reminds us of the origins in struggle. How far have we come? How far away from those origins are we now?
Well, that's actually ended up being a more complicated question than I of course that's always true, right? But than I initially thought, because I assumed that I was going to find early Black Studies programs that were very connected to community struggle and very engaged in communities. And in many cases that's true. But what I think I also discovered, and this was true at a lot of institutions, especially research universities, is that even though administrators conceded to create Black Studies, they didn't believe in it. They didn't believe in its intellectual legitimacy. And so they created it and then wanted to, then there were always clashes over resources and hiring. They wanted to marginalize it, isolate it. They didn't give it the sort of funding or status or respect that students had envisioned. So actually the struggle to create Black Studies ended up consuming a lot of the time and political energies of this first generation of Black Studies scholars. They had to fight to survive. They had to fight to get resources to make their units going propositions and to ensure that they didn't, many administrators thought, well, okay, we'll give this to students, they'll go on and graduate, and maybe in a couple of years Black Studies will go away. And so, probably instead of being as engaged in the community as many of these professors initially hoped, some of them maybe, they ended up being, their political fights were closer to home. But I should say that at many campuses, there were very creative ways to link up to the community, whether it was starting educational programs in penal institutions, or here in Chicago there was the Communiversity, connecting community and university, a Saturday education program. On the south side in the same building where the Center for Inner City Studies is today.
Which got resurrected 30 years later in a similar project. Right,
exactly, that you were involved in. So there are actually a lot of creativity in these years, and there was a parallel movement to create, a parallel to the Black Studies movement, because one wing of the struggle said, look, we'll never achieve autonomy or self-determination in white-controlled institutions. So they at a certain point shifted their focus away from Black Studies toward building what were known as IBIs, or independent Black institutions. And many of these were very creative, unique institutions. Some of them had, became a challenge to raise money and financing, so they often didn't survive the 1970s. But that was another form that connecting with the community took.
So I have to ask you, as a historian, kind of methodological question, and it's not a complicated one, but it's not something technical, but I'm just wondering what some of the surprises were and things that you found. I think I remember, like years ago, you met with Stan Willis, and he had a treasure trove of things that you weren't expecting to find. What kind of evidence did you find, or what kind of things that you discover in interviews that you did not expect to discover, or you found particularly moving or compelling?
Oh, wow.
Should I have warned you of that question before?
I've already alluded to the fact that there was more, all of these controversies and the struggle just to survive and to acquire legitimacy for African American studies. I think I was,
you interviewed some pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think that one thing I found is that most people were very excited to tell their stories and had a real sense of being omitted from the historical narrative. And I think there was a strong sense of that. And that was an interesting thing for me to think about. Why hadn't this chapter in the Black freedom struggle really been included in a lot of historical accounts? And I think that, I think one part of the answer to that, and what made it, complex, was that, and this was not true in all places, but students really took, in some campuses, students took seriously this idea of armed struggle. They did target practice, they acquired weapons, they engaged in vandalism, they planted small bombs. This happened at San Francisco State University. And I think that that's probably complicated their inclusion in kind of the pantheon of civil rights heroes. It doesn't always conform to what scholars call the politics of respectability. And understanding who the heroes are in the long Black freedom struggle. So there were controversial tactics, certainly controversial rhetoric, and I think that wasn't really a surprise in the research, but it was interesting to see how that shaped many of the participants' sense of their own, what that meant for them in their own lives.
Mm-hmm. Did you find, as I would assume that this is the case, your first book made a significant impact both on the field, and I think a lot of activists appreciated documenting particularly the role of the black left in New York politics after World War II, and then your own activism. Did you have difficulty finding people would trust you with their stories, especially because sometimes illegal tactics may have been used in the past? I mean, was there a trust issue, and was that a difficult hurdle to overcome in terms of getting, people you interviewed to open up?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And in some ways, it was less of an issue than I thought it would be, because I found that people tended to be eager to tell their stories. Probably at San Francisco State, that was the bigger question, because it was a very, I think that some of those students went on to become, activists over the next several decades, and I think that they had developed a sense of peace or understanding of what 68 and 69 had meant. They had some resolution about that period, and there are others for whom it's still very unresolved, and I think that made it difficult, I think, to work through and to really, to really talk about. But most people were really excited to share their stories.
So I'm going to ask Martha one more question, and then we're going to open it up for you all to ask succinct questions at the microphones that are on either side. Now, I know people have stories to tell, and that's good, and that's what makes this kind of public conversation a rich one. So that's fine too. But I just say succinct, just on past experience. But the final question is, and including myself being at the mic, right? The final question I want to ask you is about legacy. And you alluded to it in your talk. It's kind of artificial to say lessons in the sense that there are no blueprints for struggle, but what do you think the takeaway is for young activists on campus today?
No, it's a great question, and I tried to allude to some of that at the close of the talk. I mean, I think these students were good organizers in the sense that before they created their demands, before they decided what they wanted to ask for and what the goals would be of their struggle, they did research. They talked to each other. They built new organizations, and I think that kind of relationship building on campus and really learning and getting to know. So, what are your issues? Is it financial aid? Is it that you have a racist professor? And there were lots of examples of that. Really doing research and finding out, was it discrimination in the dormitory? What was it that really were the students' grievances, and really kind of learning your local situation? I think that was critical, and I think students can do that in any era and at any place, and that's kind of where you begin. Another key lesson is that students, this campus struggle was part and parcel of the Black liberation struggle in general, right? So these campuses were part of communities. Students built relationships with people in the towns and cities where they lived. They had alliances with ministers, with local community activists. So when they were in trouble, when they got arrested, when the police came, they could get support and allies from off campus. So I think students today can learn a lot from that, whether they're working on living wage campaigns on campus, build allies and relationships off campus, whether they're trying to forge greater coalitions with immigrant rights struggles, get involved with the immigrant rights organizations off campus. So doing your homework on campus and building locally, internally strong organizations, but build ties in the community as well.
And don't have romantic views about that. Some folks are going to support, and some folks are going to criticize, and that's all part and parcel of building movement.
And another point that goes to this question of romanticizing. And I think sometimes young people today have this sense that, we'll never achieve what they achieved in the 60s. That generation was so special, and we, kind of trying to live up to it is a great burden. And I sometimes get that sense in talking to young people. And I think that, one thing I try and show in this book, and I follow several of the student leaders and where they go in their life, that for them this was just the beginning. They look back and they said, we made mistakes. There were flaws. We weren't feminist enough. We were too, that was one lesson that a lot of people learned. And so, this was the beginning of a process of growth and searching and exploration. And so I wanted to show that the students changed over time, and they learned new lessons, and they got involved in new political fights. So for them, political growth and political learning was a cardinal value. They didn't stay frozen in the politics of 1969. They don't themselves hold that up as the high watermark. They've been involved in struggles their whole lives.
So while the questions are being formulated from the audience and people make their way to the mics down here, if you want to ask a question, you mentioned gender and feminism. I wasn't necessarily going to ask that question, but you brought it up, and you had that great photograph of Eva Jefferson at the mic with women's rights in front of her, and obviously that became a part of her political trajectory. But what were some of the gender politics in the struggles that you studied?
Well, that's really a long answer, but I'll try and do it briefly. As I mentioned, the Black Power period is known really for, very masculinist politics and rhetoric and style. And there was a kind of widespread absorption of this idea that the movement really needed to restore black manhood, that racism, white supremacy had emasculated black men, and this was the time, this was the moment for black women to step aside and allow black men to assume positions of leadership. And you see this idea, this notion and this motive and this rhetoric, across many campuses in 1968, 1969. But again, as I mentioned just a minute ago, people didn't stay frozen in time. There was a constant process of political learning. And when you track campus activism into the 1970s, you see many more young black women stepping to the fore in terms of providing campus leadership and advocating for their own kinds of curricular, for their own kinds of courses and programming. On the intellectual level, in terms of the intellectual history, really the rise of black women's studies and black feminism in black studies emerges particularly in the 1980s as a major answer to this earlier gender politics. So it becomes like an important, really kind of revisionist development within African American studies.
Okay, we got questions. Yes, please.
Well, thank you for your talk. It was excellent.
You can probably take it off of there.
I have a question about black colleges. So, that's also one aspect I'm glad you're focusing on, because a lot of people forget the struggles that happened on black college campuses for black studies. But I was wondering, you mentioned that they suffered more police violence, but I wonder how administrators responded. Did they respond in the same way as white college campuses? Were the administrators black? Were they white on black college campuses? So I just wonder if you can talk a little bit about the dynamics there.
HBCUs.
Okay, that is Latasha Levy, who is
Why don't you pass the mic rather than put it in that?
That question was from Latasha Levy, who is a doctoral candidate in the Department of African American Studies at Northwestern, writing a dissertation on modern black conservatism. On the job market. So the question was...
Look for the book in a couple of years.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, and it's a complicated answer because most administrators were African American at HBCUs in these years, and they typically did not want to bring the police on campus. But where you saw this happen mostly was at public universities that had white governors and white state legislators clamoring to bring the National Guard. And so that was a very typical scenario. Or if it was a private college, it might be the white-dominated board of trustees that was doing that. At HBCUs, the students, there was just a very vibrant, mass movement among students at historically black colleges, and their goals were diverse. They shared some of the goals that black students had at predominantly white institutions. You might think, wasn't Black Studies already in the curriculum at places like Howard and Fisk and Southern? But surprisingly, they weren't. They didn't have independent Black Studies departments. And many of the scholars there said one of the effects of Brown and the whole integrationist politics of the post-war era was in some sense, whiten the curriculum. And that at Howard, they felt there were more Black Studies courses in the 1930s than there were in the 1950s. So students wanted to restore that intellectual tradition, but they wanted to create independent departments. And they were not as successful in that as they hoped to be. But there were many other goals in which they were very successful at, particularly in upgrading the institutions. They worried that black colleges would actually become casualties of the era of integration. The probably single most important goal of the black student movement at HBCUs was to preserve black colleges, was to defend their existence and ensure that they survive as black-controlled institutions in this era of integration. They had seen what happened to public black primary and secondary schools after Brown, that they had been dissolved and that many black administrators and teachers had lost their jobs. So black students were fighting for the preservation of black colleges, but then for the upgrading of black colleges, for equal financing from state legislators. They wanted more spending. They wanted more faculty. They wanted an upgraded, improved education. They wanted better facilities. So they were fighting for all of that. And like their counterparts on white campuses, they were fighting for the end of in loco parentis. They wanted student rights, the rights to be recognized as adults. These were all important battles on all college campuses, the anti-war movement to end compulsory ROTC. All of these issues were important, very, very important at HBCUs.
We have a lot of questions.
Okay.
And it played out differently on different HBCUs, and people don't often know the conservative histories of a lot of HBCUs, which also came up against the Black Power movement.
Hello, hi, my name is Honey Harris, and I want to know, how can I get people to get involved?
Yeah. Is it on? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay.
How can I've started a green workshop at the Greater Grand Crossing Library, and I've donated a compost bin. I'm really trying to get people excited, telling them that you don't have to have a lot of funds to help the earth. And it's like, my last event, I had 2 people there, and it was some really great information. I'm giving them food, I'm even giving them gifts. But I mean, how can I live in, an urban society, and thing is though I'm reaching out to them, so how can I get them motivated? I'm engaging
Around
people.
Environmental issues, you're saying?
So I'm trying to get them to come out and support, because I feel like the earth is all our business to help and things.
Yeah, there are a lot of groups in Chicago. Maybe you're connected to some of them. Naomi Davis and Blacks in Green and Community Garden movements.
Well, I live right down the street from Gary Comer Charter School. Yeah. Now they're doing a lot of stuff for kids, but I'm trying to get the adults involved. And like, I'm almost begging people to give me their garbage.
I think the lesson from Martha's book and a lot of others, is that it's up and down. I mean, Martha mentioned Prexy Nesbitt before, who was one of the leaders of the Free South Africa movement in this country. I mean, we had events where there were 5 or 6 people. You look back on it and you say, oh, the anti-apartheid movement was this great mass movement. Not every meeting, not every phase of struggle. So I think perseverance, and it's good you're doing that.
Thank you, Dr. Biondi. I have a question about affirmative action. Given your research, it's also a historical question and an activist question related to the contemporary moment. Currently, there is a case that's going to be before the Supreme Court this month called Fisher versus University of Texas, which the Supreme Court is going to review affirmative action. The law of affirmative action law that comes out in 2003 under Gutter has a sunset clause. So the Supreme Court says that there is a moment in time where affirmative action and higher education being interested in preserving, having diversity will come to an end. So given that is set in our constitutional law, our jurisprudence, how do you think current students are going to struggle, or how do you think current students should struggle against ending affirmative action?
Okay, excellent question. Dwayne Nash, a doctoral student at Northwestern, doing a great dissertation on the history of stop and frisk policies in New York.
Martha does an ad for every every Northwestern student that comes up.
Well, there's one more.
That's good.
Okay, very good question. It's of course the United States is about to become a majority-minority nation, and so this idea that diversity as a sunset clause, I mean, is just like on its face, it's crazy, right? It doesn't make any sense. I think what students have to do is one lesson we learn as civil rights scholars is that these victories are always precarious, they're never permanent, and the struggle always continues. And that's true for every generation, has to keep kind of fighting and refighting these struggles. one point about affirmative action to remember is that this is was a watered down concession. I mean, students at the time had a much more robust definition of social change. Whether it was open admissions, I mean, they were fighting for free higher education, and they were really arguing that the government should shift its spending from the military, from the war in Vietnam, to make higher education more widely accessible. So I think we can look to their robust and capacious vision and not be satisfied with even this watered down version of affirmative action that they're trying to tell us needs to be eradicated. I think we have to not only push back against that, but push back farther and demand something much, much bolder. And I think that that's going to require, though, forming coalitions, forming relationships, and educating this generation about what's at stake. I mean, a lot of people have no idea that this case is on the Supreme Court docket. They keep revisiting and revisiting affirmative action and undermining it and undermining it and undermining it. And I think it's up to us to, in some ways, reframe the debate away from the very problematic way they've defined diversity and re-ground it in principles of justice.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Hunter Adams III, and I really appreciate your lecture. In fact, it brought back many memories of my own activist days, which haven't ended. One of the things that you talked about I thought was really important was the tangential movement of activism into different fields. And you did talk about how people became lawyers and financiers and other things. One of the things that happened out of the movement was the quest for changing the curriculum in public schools, in elementary schools, in high schools. And one person who was involved in that initially was Dr. Asa Hilliard from Georgia State University. And he conceptualized this notion, working with students in the community in Portland and the local NAACP there, of desegregating the curriculum. That was the thrust. And to do that, there had to be a curriculum of inclusion where African American and Native American, Latino, Asians' contributions to this society and globally could be included in the curriculum. And that movement spread across the country, and many school districts with predominantly African American populations allocated millions of dollars to that. But it collapsed because of budget crisis and cutbacks. So, and the same thing is happening with Black Studies on many campuses, which I'm sure you're aware, that going from departments to just divisions in a broader context of ethnic studies or humanities or so forth. So the thrust of the significance of what that movement brought is being diluted, and I think it's making it difficult for younger students today to organize around those issues. So I'm just asking you, what do you think about that? What would you offer as a suggestion for youth today, students today, to rekindle that activism? And thank you.
Thank you. A great question, and it gives me an opportunity to just sort of remind everyone that even though I don't write about particularly high school activism, that was a very important part of this story, was coincident with the college battles. In fact, was a precursor in many cities. I mean, these students came to college as activist high school students in some instances. So the kind of ferment on high school campuses, again, with a new agenda, not calling for integration anymore, but calling for more Black teachers, more Black principals, Black history in the classroom. We see this in Chicago. We see this in New York, the fight for community control in New York, closely allied with the fight at Brooklyn College in the borough of Brooklyn. Both of those were centered. So the activism among high school students was very, very important. Now, even though, as I alluded to earlier, Black Studies faced a lot of opposition, particularly in its early years. Today, the opposition tends to be less sort of it's less around challenging its intellectual legitimacy, and it's more what you suggested around budget cuts. So there might be like budget cuts, and administrators want to collapse together African American studies, Latino studies, and makes ethnic studies departments, for example. That happens in some places. So we all have to be on the lookout in this era of sort of neoliberalism and austerity. We have to sort of fight to maintain, the principles around and the autonomy of our curriculum. But the lower public and primary and secondary education, the curriculum has always, in many ways, been much more politicized, the fights, than it has been in the universities. Because you have school boards or state legislatures overseeing these requirements, and they've been very resistant and hostile to ethnic studies, black studies, really incorporating that in a meaningful, lasting, and true way. So because you have these politicians more involved in looking at the curriculum on the local level, or state legislators, I mean, Texas is a very famous example of this, and Texas drives the textbook industry in the United States. Texas has enormous power over the creation of textbooks. It's made it really hard, even in a watered-down version of multiculturalism, to penetrate the Texas textbook industry, which, again, serves national student audiences. So that's been a huge struggle.
Yeah, I want to add, though, too, I think, there's certainly that difference, but I think some of the ideological battles that still go on around what we might term black studies, or even radical thinkers in the academy, or people of color, is in publishing, in promotion and tenure and hiring struggles, that people think that certain kinds of scholarship is less legitimate, certain topics are less legitimate. So that fight happens in subtle and sometimes closed door context, but it's certainly still there. The other thing I just wanted to add too is that your book is about the Black freedom movement on campus, Black revolution on campus. But when we talk about Black youth, then and now, I mean, some are not on campus, some are being forced out of high schools and into prison and barred from access to campus. And so that has to be a part of any kind of contemporary progressive agenda around Black youth.
Thank you, Professor Biondi, for the talk and this piece of scholarship, which is, I think, soon to be a classic. I had a question about something that you elaborated on in the presentation. You actually started it out, your slide, the first slide. I wrote down the caption, "Armed Negroes End Seizure, Cornell Yields." So I'm assuming that this is coverage in the white press, and I just wanted to know what thoughts you had or what you came across in terms of the framing of the revolution on campus in the black press.
And what's his dissertation?
Weston Haywood is doing a dissertation on the black press. So he's asking me about the black press because that's he's doing in the 20th century. So thank you. What was very different, first of all, there was much more coverage of it, as you would imagine. The Chicago Defender, the Amsterdam News, all of the black newspapers covered the story sort of earlier and quicker. I mean, the big white national papers like the New York Times would cover it. That was a New York Times photo when there was a dramatic case such as that. And as violence started to happen in police occupations, you got a little more coverage in the white press. But the black press tended to frame it, you see progression over time. I mean, like, I'm thinking immediately of Howard. And in the early years, there were many Howard graduates who were writing for the black press and saw these students as disrespectful and unruly, and they didn't like that they took over a building, and so they portrayed them that way. But then as they saw the kind of reasonableness of their demands and that they were doing orderly protests, then the coverage sort of shifted and it was much more favorable. I think and I think this is generally true for HBCUs. I think as initially this was seen as kind of rude and inappropriate, but as they saw that the students were actually trying to improve the institutions, that their fight was to improve and preserve and defend HBCUs, you saw the black press really follow that very closely. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Kevin Clemenza. I'm a freshman at DePaul University, and considering the 1960s was considered the social and youth movement, both in the U.S. and Europe, for liberalism. Would you think the dynamics and objectiveness of and effectiveness of protests have changed today, considering Wall Street and then students at colleges?
Can you kind of re-articulate that last part of your question again?
Do you think the dynamics and effectiveness of protests have changed today, considering the protests within the past 2 years?
You allude to Occupy Wall Street, kind of comparing that to
Occupy Wall Street, and then there's been college sit-ins like in California.
Yeah.
Would you think like the effectiveness and meaningness of protests have changed, like less or like gone less important, or
one of the
not
key things?
effective?
I mean, one of the key things you were just saying. The context I think is important. That absent a larger mass movement, what happens on campuses is going to, the impact of what happens on campuses is going to be affected by whether there's a larger mass movement, and we haven't seen a sustained mass movement in the same way that we had. Occupy Wall Street was youth-driven in some respects, but was an off-campus struggle, and there have been these, I don't know, you answer the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I think for a while, the Occupy movement did seem to be affecting the policy debate. The whole anxiety about the deficit seemed to recede as concerns around unemployment or other issues arose. But I think what we saw with Occupy, and we've been seeing this around the world, is really heavy-handed police tactics, real crackdown on civil liberties, these mass arrests, these clearing of these protests. And that, of course, happened in the 60s, too, but there would often be like another wave of students who would come out. A group would get arrested, and there'd be another wave that would come in. And, we did see that with Occupy, but I think that, now a lot of these, we're seeing some judges now say that a lot of these arrests were unfair. We're seeing now a kind of judicial, in a sense, I don't know what the word is, but some of these cases are like either being thrown out or there's being some sanction for what happened. So it's resolving itself in a more bureaucratic kind of judicial way rather than out on the streets. But I think this is an unfinished story. Yeah. And I should in my response to you, mention the CTU and the incredible organizing that they did in the recent Chicago teacher strike, and how that in some ways is a model, right? Building relationships between organized labor and community groups and parents, and seeing that as a kind of really impressive, forceful model to rebuke these policies of austerity and privatization that are just happening without any deliberation, we're seeing our schools transform without citizens participating in this process at all or voicing their opinions. And so I think what we just saw in Chicago is a great model for how citizens can fight back and push back and say, we're envisioning an alternative. We have a different conception of education than what's being delivered to us. And I think there was a fight in the media to get that story out. But certainly through the internet and through alternative media, we were able to get some of that story out. But it was as we saw, very startling, right, to the administration to be challenged so effectively and so vociferously.
We have another question over here.
Yeah, hi. My name is Martin Unzueta. I'm from a community organization in Little Village, and. It's more or less some comment, because I think that the African American movement is coming to I don't know, it's not exactly continuous fighting right now, because there are places where the African Americans are very, very hidden by the system, and I can say that because I was arrested the last year in November in Montgomery, Alabama. And we went to the jail. We went to the jail because we make a civil disobedience. So that is why we went to the jail. But when we were there in the jail, in the municipal jail, it was full of African Americans. Only African Americans and us.
In the jail?
In the jail.
In jail.
And any white men was there. So the white men doesn't broke the law in Montgomery, Alabama. Well, this is something that is failing in the system over there. So when we began to talk with the people about why we were in jail, because we make the civil disobedience, the people identified with us, and when they begin to talk about the movement of the African Americans, and they were very happy because we make a civil disobedience. But the thing is, something is failing here because the movement stays still, it doesn't move anymore. Yeah, maybe they have no senators, not African American senators, for example. No, they are not representing in the Senate, and I don't exactly know, but I think that somebody told me that the government needs to refer the vote for the African Americans each 5 or 15 years, something like this. There are equality in these systems, or there are almost equality, or there are nothing of equality. So that is something that is wrong here, because the African American movement needs to know that the immigrants, we are in the same place that they are. No? We are exploited by the owners, so we are fighting with the owners. I don't know. There are a lot of things that we need to talk about with the African American movement, the immigrant movement here in this country.
Okay.
Martine should also be acknowledged as someone who has been building coalitions and has been very much in the forefront of labor struggles at the Republic Window and Doors, as well as the struggle around undocumented workers and others in the city. So, and in Atlanta, I mean, some of the former civil rights leaders I know did come out in solidarity in making those ties, and the freedom rides that you all participated in, I think, very much echoed the struggle of past decades. But you're right when you raise this question about, are things stagnant, are they not moving forward? And it's complicated. I mean, there are no African Americans in the Senate right now. On the other hand, where there is representation, sometimes there's not the kind of accountability that we hoped there would be at the highest level. So, I think the demand for representation too is a limited one, and we really need to think about the kinds of demands that are going to be truly transformative and not potentially cosmetic. But Martha may have something to say on that.
I mean,
too.
I just wanted to sort of, thank you for bringing up, telling us what your experience in a jail in Mobile, Alabama was like. So you go in and you see, oh, this is filled with African American men. Mass incarceration in the contemporary period, as scholars and activists like Michelle Alexander, Ruth Wilson Gilmore have shown us, right? This has been, part of a very sustained and concerted, I think, attack on the political and economic status of African Americans since the 1980s. And we see this in many ways, in sort of a structural unemployment, in high mortality rates, in mass incarceration. And one function of mass incarceration is, in a sense, is to demobilize a population, to disenfranchise a population, but also to make invisible kind of a population, and to deprive a population of people at their peak earning years, and when families are being formed, et cetera. So it has a devastating multiple effects and impacts. And one is certainly on the political demobilization that you're identifying. And I think you're also pointing to one way out, which is that to build coalitions with Latinos, with African Americans and Latinos, and seeing that as something that might be promising to help us move forward and to build strength politically in these cities that are under siege, that have high rates of people in jail, that have mass joblessness, that have young people being pushed out of schools. And I think you're exactly right. It takes hard work, and I know you're deeply involved in it, but I do think that this is one bright example we can think of what we need to pursue.
Given the racial history of this country and the powers that be, we're entering an extremely dangerous, violent, and upheaval type era in the 21st century that cannot be ignored. We must talk about this because it's going to get real interesting. And I think we're smelling the way the current president is being treated, irregardless of what we think of the man. That's irrelevant to me. I'm looking at the resurgent, fanatical, white extremism that I'm seeing on local levels throughout every state in this country. My connection and bloodline with Texas and Chicago. And what I'm seeing on the ground, I'm seeing people polishing their weapons, getting ready for something. And I can feel it in the air, and it's getting real thick. So it would be interesting for you to say something about that.
Thank you.
Hi, so I was happy to hear you talk about high school students and their activism, and I was wondering, one of the common criticisms, particularly of high school students at the same time in Chicago, for instance, who walked out, is that they didn't think that high school students could be doing this on their own. There must be some adult agitating, and thinking about Barbara sitting up there too, and Ella Baker's work with young people. No, I mean, but I was just curious if you could speak a bit more about the relationship between some of these campus activists and other older folks in various movements and how that worked out.
One more. Bring it home.
Thank you for your fascinating talk, Professor Biondi. So in your book, you mentioned Black Studies movement embraced concepts of the African diaspora. So I'm curious about how students conceptualize the diaspora. Also, if you can speak about their strategies in solidifying ties across the diaspora. And finally, to what extent do you think that diasporic reach helped shape the local struggle?
Help shape what?
Their local struggle.
Oh,
you remember all of them?
Yeah.
I wrote them down.
Yeah. Okay. And we don't have very long. First.
You have to.
Okay. Well, the question of guns. I mean, I heard
the first one was Kent State.
Okay, the first one was Kent State. Well, guns, more guns. They're unified in the sense that, politicians, I guess, in Ohio and Mississippi, the governors and the local sheriffs, I mean, they really gave very carte blanche to the kinds of weaponry that law enforcement can carry, and the kind of, this kind of recourse to bring in heavily armed law enforcement, and who had, were very quick to shoot to kill. This was happening on several college campuses. North Carolina, and 2 students were killed in Southern University in Louisiana in 1972, and an investigation found that all the kind of law enforcement on that campus, they had brought in people it was up to that individual officer's decision what kind of armaments to carry. And they were all carrying a range of crazy stuff. And there was a protest, to the White House saying that Nixon, had a commission after Kent State, in which, college presidents were urged, don't bring in the police. Settle these disputes without bringing in the police, because the police, you bring them in and somebody's going to get killed. And so that happened again in 1972. So that's certainly a commonality. I just heard, I think it was on Democracy Now! This morning, that Colorado, where there was just, this, in one of these recent mass killings, they have amended their conceal and carry law now to allow it to happen on college campuses. So we're seeing that happen, that now students will be armed on college campuses. There's been a spate of conceal and carry laws passed around the country. There was just an article in the New York Times a few days ago saying that there's a huge increase in guns being retrieved at checkpoints at airports. People are forgetting they have their guns as they try and go through security, and they're being discovered. And they're saying, why is this happening now? And so the 2 reasons it's happening now: a big spike in gun purchases in recent years, and I think this goes to your concern that we're really at this very volatile point, and you have this aggrieved population that's arming itself. I think that we see evidence of that. So a spike in gun purchases, and then this passage of conceal and carry laws, so that now people can lawfully carry concealed weapons kind of anywhere. And so these are very disturbing trends, there's no doubt. Vijay Prashad likes to be more optimistic and say, Arizona's not the future, right? It's the past. This shows their panic and their fear and their anxiety about changing demographics. So, we just hope and struggle and try and ensure that this is a peaceful transition.
The other 2 questions were about the elders and diaspora.
Asada Kokai, another Northwestern student, asked about working on reproductive rights. Well, in some ways it was more the faculty, it was the scholars rather than the students who were elaborating plans for Black studies and incorporated a diasporic vision. The students went in this direction in their activist careers when they left campuses, and they developed very concrete ways of assisting. And whether it was the Pan-African Skills Project, whether it was providing forms of assistance to continuing anti-colonial struggles in Southern Africa, founding the African Liberation Support Committee. For example, there were a lot of concrete, practical solidarity efforts that the students did. The professors, in their concept of diaspora, in some ways it was, for many it was global, you know, the African diaspora in Latin America. Some articulated it as Pan-Africanism in a specific way. As I mentioned before, others called it third worldism, and they had a more global anti-colonial sense. So there's variation, but I think what you do see it really all over the country is, in a sense, we don't want Black studies to be confined to the United States. We have to include the world in some fashion. A lot of administrative resistance to that. Just because people wanted it doesn't mean they got it. And that was very, very typical. And I'm forgetting what, about elders. And that was Professor Todd Breland at UIC, who is working on a great book on Black education in Chicago, and is a scholar of education. I'm forgetting now exactly. What did she ask about elders?
How did elders support the students, or what was the relationship between young people on campus and elders in community?
This was,
I used
thank
the word
you for
elder.
asking.
You said older people.
Yeah, thank you for asking.
Agitators.
Because that was really important. I mean, this was, no question, this was a youth movement. But one ways in which they built relationships in a savvy way is that they had intergenerational relationships. And in ways that, back to your question of what surprised me in the archive, well, I'm not expecting to see that there's going to be an SCLC minister in LA that is the chief's, the student's main kind of elder supporter, right? Because the literature often portrays the civil rights old guard as being very suspicious and very, oppositional to these young Black power militants. And in some cases that's true. Like somebody like Roy Wilkins is a great example of that. But you find that the students cultivate relationships with ministers, with clergy, with Shirley Chisholm. Sometimes it's elected officials, Ron Dellums, Willie Brown. So they had lots of relationships with those kinds of elders, ministers, elected officials, who in California were passing state legislation to create affirmative action. So they had very strategic, pragmatic relationships with elected officials and with ministers in the community.
This book, it's a very, very rich chronicle of a very, very important chapter of struggle. People asked about the connection between then and now, and I think, Martha and I are historians, so, we're not living in the past. It's a different moment and different contradictions, but there are still important struggles on and off campuses, and one of the struggles is about who's not on the campus, which is back to the question of the epidemic of mass incarceration. So I think there's both a fight over the corporatization of campuses, which I think is quite consistent with the Black Revolution on campus and what people were fighting for, opening them up and making them accountable. And then there's a fight about the exclusion of a whole lot of young Black men and women who are in prisons, who ought to be in classrooms teaching us. So thank you for the book.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming out.